Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. Today's episode of Orchestration for Beginners is a continuation of part 1, so we're now in part 2 for orchestrating a Tutti passage. We will be talking about how to orchestrate strings and brass together. We'll be bringing in the woodwinds, and we will end with Tutti Orchestration, Tutti. A quick rapid-fire review of part 1. First, we orchestrated strings. Some of the important topics we talked about were hearing the highest partial, so the root, the third, the fifth, and the highest voice. We also talked a lot about the ambitus, the distance between the lowest voices and the highest voices, and how to kind of bridge those gaps. And we also talked about the tessitura, so placing instruments in the same group in comparable tessituras. Then I talked about an orchestration class that I'm currently developing that will be made available on YouTube here as well as my website. I have some more ideas that I'll be sharing later on in this episode. Super excited. And then we ended with orchestration of the brass. We talked again about the ambitus of the brass. It's a technical thing that you have to start thinking about it. I never heard it discussed in America, but it's something I had to learn when I was orchestrating in the French style. We also talked about voicing and spacing of the brass. And then I gave a very important rule for balance for French horns at a forte volume or higher in the brass. One final thing is, how can you get better at orchestration? I will expand upon some of the things I talked about in last episode. So the most immediate solution is to listen to live music, okay? No, not at home, not on Spotify, but literally going physically. In French, you go sur place, we say, and you hear live music. Now, given that you're composing for orchestra, I would assume you go to an orchestra concert, but it doesn't have to be. But the key is to hear live music. It doesn't have to be a professional standard. You can listen to amateur groups. You can even hear like student high school groups. And in fact, it might be better because you're going to hear the raw state of what the orchestration is without like the polished version. A much longer term solution, of course, is to get better at harmony, because the vast majority of the problems we encounter in orchestration can be linked to harmony. So go attack it at the source. And a medium term solution, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, is to orchestrate piano scores. This is how the French study orchestration. Mozart, Beethoven, Debussy, you get the piano score, and then you realize it for orchestra. Let's begin. All right, orchestration of strings and brass. As a reminder, when you're orchestrating, ultimately you have to think of these groups together. It's almost impossible to only think of one group and not consider the other. Balancing strings and brass, in general, I don't find that there are extreme problems to really think about. That's more so with the woodwinds. Maybe you want to think about placing the violins higher above the brass so they don't compete in the same region. But keep in mind, you do have a lot of string players, so they often can compete with the brass. In this particular example from my symphony, Helpisontheway, you can see that the roles are very different. Brass have parallel moving chords versus strings are just on undulating tremolos. Adjusting dynamics. So many times what we'll do in orchestration, in order to compensate for the brass, because they do have a tendency to play too loud or to be too present, is that we'll just anticipate these problems in advance by marking down the dynamics. So in this example from Helpisontheway, you can see I have the brass at forte and the strings are at fortissimo. I actually don't know if this would even be necessary. I think the orchestration would work really well, just the strings are forte anyway, because they are doing solo-ponticello, they're doing tremolo, we're definitely going to hear them. So when I look at this piece kind of from a distance, I think the marking of fortissimo is indicating that the composer wants a really big, thick sound, like something really climactic, and then the brass will kind of fit themselves within that. Ultimately, we would have to hear the live performance to really know how this will actually sound. Finally, I want to talk about the percussion. Now, if the percussion truly is something important for you, you're hearing it in your compositional process, then what I'm about to say may not apply. But for everyone else, listen very carefully. I think one of the problems with beginning orchestrators is they rely too much on the percussion because it creates instant color and they neglect harmony. I highly recommend for your first orchestration work to just go for simple but effective percussion. So the traditional roles of the percussion are to reinforce the tonality, right? The timpani was the first instrument to enter the orchestra, percussion instrument, and to reinforce the rhythms. So if we look at Help Us on the Way, you could see the opening, we have the marimba, and it's on B flat and F. Okay, it's a B flat minor chord, so there's no D flat in the marimba, so that means it's a very B flat heavy chord. So I was hearing like a really rock solid tonic, almost aggressively so. We have the timpani on the B flat, so reinforcing the root, and then we have bass drum and tom-toms reinforcing the brass rhythm. Notice that the bass drum and tom-toms are not playing when the brass are holding. This is because when I was actually listening to the orchestration, I found it was way too muddy. Now we're going to orchestrate the woodwinds. So when you're dealing with the woodwinds, especially if it's a tutti passage, especially if it's a forte passage, your big concern is going to be, can we hear the woodwinds or are they serving an actual purpose? Okay, so in general, what I would say, there's two methods to dealing with the woodwinds and concerning the brass, because the brass, of course, can really overpower them very quickly. Keep in mind they sit close together. The first solution is to place the woodwinds above the brass, and the second solution would be to double the woodwinds and the strings. When you place the woodwinds above the brass, I personally find, this is by no means a rule, but I personally find I have a preference that there's at least the distance of a 6 between like the lowest upper woodwind, like the clarinet 2, and the highest trumpet. This just ensures that they can compete. The woodwinds can sound full and they can really add to the chord. Many times it's not possible to do this, okay, and the woodwinds have a little bit of a different role, but just what I find that seems to work well. In this example from Beethoven, you can see that he has, it's the end of the 7th Symphony. He has flutes very high up there, oboes up there, clarinets up there, brass and medium register. So it's very obvious that he was attuned to orchestration and that we're going to hear the woodwinds really well. Another example from my symphony, this is from the first movement, A Safe Home. You can see that we have the flutes high register, oboes high-ish register, clarinets quite very energetic register, definitely going to be piercing. And we see the French horns are getting upper register, so they will project, they will be noticeable, but they're still below the woodwinds. Notice that the trumpets will definitely project, but their highest note is a concert E, and in the woodwinds, their lowest note is a concert E, and afterwards they're placed up. So definitely in this passage, the woodwinds will be heard and will be felt. The other option, of course, is to double the strings. And this is something that a lot of opera composers in the classic era, like the actual classical era and the beginning of the Romantic era, did very well. For example, a really great orchestration resource would be Gluck. I think his operas are very well orchestrated, very clean, not necessarily like super colorful, not necessarily like, innovative, but highly effective, and it sounds really crisp. So you can study that in your own time. In this example of Help Us on the Way from the first movement, my symphony, you can see I have the flutes doubling the first violins at the unison, and then I have the oboes and the clarinets doubling the second violins at the unison. The actual example we're working on from Help Us on the Way, you can see that the woodwinds are fulfilling neither of these roles, okay? So in this case, the woodwinds are doubling the brass, so at the unison. And there are many reasons you might want to do this, but two of the most common reason I find are one, to thicken the sound, okay? And also to dilute the timbre, because the brass can have a very aggressive sound sometimes, and maybe you want to just take a little bit of the bite out of the sound. A very important skill that you need when you're orchestrating is how to quickly identify the doublings, right? Score reading, quickly knowing what's going on. Don't feel bad if you're struggling with this. I think it's very common, even for professional composers. You look at a score and you don't really know what's going on right away. So the way around it is to kind of really use your brain. So we see the oboes are on a fourth. Okay, so automatically I can pair that with the trumpets, so the oboes are doubling the trumpets. Bassoon's a little trickier, right? It's tenor clef. There's always going to be more hesitation when it's like an unusual clef. The way to get around this is to think very rationally. So we have the woodwinds clearly in homophonic writing in chords, and we see four voices. So when you see woodwinds in four voices like this, there are two possibilities. Usually, one is they're in 4-part harmony, and two is they might be in 3-part harmony, in which the middle voice usually is at the, being doubled at the unison between the two groups. So we have to quickly verify. So we see the lowest note of the bassoon has to be a B flat, because we know where the middle C is located, and then we know their woodwinds are at 4-part harmony. I want to take a quick detour about the clefs and solfege. I think it is important to understand the application of solfege when it comes to orchestration. In general, I have to say, I think a lot of solfege classes end up being a waste of time. I know it's harsh to say it like that, but I've taken many solfege classes in America, as well as some in France. And looking back, I don't really think all the time and effort that I put in them brought really good results. It is helpful, but at the end of the day, when you're spending 4 or 5 hours a week preparing solfege exercises, when you could be composing or like learning actual harmony, it just seems hard to justify. So what are the essential takeaways that I can say for orchestration classes? I think you need to know some of the clefs. It's really helpful. I think the soprano clef, the alto clef, and the tenor clef are the most important clefs to work with. So the alto clef you need for the violas, and the violas are an integral part of the strings. So that's got to be rectified. You got to work on that, okay? The tenor clef is useful for the bassoon when it gets in the upper register, cello as well, and sometimes the trombone will use the tenor clef. The soprano clef is surprisingly very, very useful. I know composers usually only really work with this when you're doing Bach chorales, or kind of fugue, advanced fugue, you'll use the soprano clef. But really for orchestration, it's important because if you have an instrument in the key of A, you're going to use the soprano clef to understand it. And also, there are times when instruments that are in B flat, like clarinet or trumpet, when the orchestra has a lot of sharps, the notation for the B flat instruments would be too many sharps to read, it'd be just ridiculous. So they have to actually use a flat key, and the way you would transpose and understand it is using the soprano clef. Make sure you're using your time wisely. If you are doing solfege studies, I would say some of these solfege exercises where they have you jumping around and it's totally anti-musical, it's good work for your brain, but the reality is most music is very linear. It's based on scales. So if you are going to do the exercises, you need to focus on within the staff. That's where these clefs are used. Once you start getting this 3 or 4 ledger lines, in orchestration context, we're going to be using the treble clef or the bass clef. Getting back to Help Us on the Way. So what is the function of the doubling here? So we see the oboes and the bassoons are doubling the upper part of the chord, which makes sense because we want them to be heard. In particular, we see oboes are doubling the trumpets, and the bassoons are doubling the French horns. If you want to see a good example of writing for bassoons and French horns, check out Tchaikovsky. Now, a big question you may be asking is, will the woodwinds be heard when doubling the brass because they're at the unison? Looking at the oboes, I would say definitely because they're in the low register, they're honky, they project, they almost feel like a Renaissance, an old Renaissance instrument here. And they're also the top of the chord, so the ear has a bias for that. With the bassoons, it's a little doubtful because they're in the tenor clefs, so that's a weaker register. They don't have much projection power. So why would I have the bassoons here when it's possible that we're not really going to hear them? Well, here's where you have to go back to understanding harmony. So if we listen to the woodwinds as a whole and we had just the oboes, then we would have parallel moving fourths. There's nothing wrong with parallel moving fourths, but that isn't part of this style at this moment in the piece. There are other sections of the piece where I have parallel fourths and fifths, so that makes more sense. But here we have parallel moving triads in the brass. So to unnecessarily outline the fourths in just the oboe would create a kind of confusion, and it also maybe draw unnecessary attention just to the oboes. So because of this reality, I had to add the bassoons to give a proper harmonic context. I like to talk about the orchestration for the entire passage as a whole, so Tutti Orchestration. But before I do, I have an important announcement. I'm currently in the process of designing an orchestration class that will be made available both on YouTube as well as on my website, barneyjmusic.com. And in this class, I will be bridging the gaps between the French tradition and the American tradition of orchestration. The beauty of the French tradition of orchestration is that the piece is already composed. You're given a piano sonata in the style of Debussy, Mozart, Beethoven, and then you have to orchestrate it. This allows you to focus just on orchestration and not be sucked in with like months or at least the weeks of first composing the piece. There is a major problem with that, and that's many times when you're orchestrating someone else's work, you don't feel like you can take certain risks. You don't feel like you can kind of compose, and ultimately orchestration is composition. So you end up just sticking to these little formulas and not being able to create something that's actually really musically interesting because you're too scared about like being, respecting and not offending the sacred master. In this example from my opera ballet Salambo, you can see it's for children's chorus, and here's the piano part. Notice in the left hand we have an arpeggio. But notice in the string orchestra version, I have removed that arpeggio. Instead, it's no longer in the bass voice, but we see it relegated to the violas, so a middle voice, and instead of doing arpeggio, it's doing a rotating kind of a trill-like figure. The reason I'm doing this is because this is my own music. I can hear it. I'm also orchestration, like I said, is still composition. It is not some independent art form. It still is composition. However, I know if this were Mozart music, and let's say someone had a really good understanding of Mozart music and kind of composed kind of differently from what was technically in the piano score, the teacher would be like, oh, you can't do this, it's too dangerous because it deviates too far from the sacred score. So a big pro in American orchestration classes that I've seen so far is that you can orchestrate in your own style, okay? It is still composition, okay? It is your music, so you're also going to be more engaged that way. There are some cons. One of the cons is that in a semester-long course, there's just not enough time to compose the piece and then orchestrate it, okay? So you're often doing like little mini exercises. It's just not really clear how they prepare you. They don't talk about balance and the technical aspects like the habitus that we're talking about on this channel, in which you would learn for the French style. Another more egregious problem I find in American tradition is that there is too much reverence for these contemporary composers. So you may have a teacher that has you look at Grisey or looks at a certain piece by Ligeti and you're like, oh wow, it's so cool. And then you try to imitate that. But the reality is, if you want to orchestrate in the style of Grisey, you have to use Grisey's music. Therefore, I want to create an orchestration class that will combine what is great from both traditions. I want to definitely do a lot of hands-on technical training of like building chords, doing phrases, orchestrating phrases, but allowing you to do it in your own style, so it's your own music, so it's directly applicable to you. We also will be looking at Mozart, Beethoven, and Debussy orchestrating some stuff, from their actual works. I do think that provides certain insight that you can't get otherwise. So I'm currently constructing the curriculum. So let me know in the comments or through my website any questions that you have about orchestration, things that you're frustrated, things that are left out of your university curriculums, so that I can kind of meet this necessary gap. Important concept is the woodwinds as sirens. We see this a lot in the classical era, so Mozart, Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, and early Beethoven. And you have these block woodwinds, usually in the upper register, forming this block chord, and we have the strings moving. It works really, really well. Charles Coughlin talks a lot about this in his orchestration manual, though it is in French. It's what we call le fond, or the background. So we can see this example from Beethoven from the Fifth Symphony, that we have these woodwinds placed high, upper register, while the strings are moving. In this example from helpisontheway, we can see we have these block woodwinds. They're definitely not in a high register. So we have the flutes and oboes on top. I would say the flutes are softening maybe the coarseness of the oboes, cooling out the sound from the brass a little bit. And we have clarinets and bassoons playing in the same range as the brass. But notice that the role of the woodwinds is different. They have a full stretch sound. They're marked up a little bit more in volume, versus the brass have a punctuated rhythm. We're going to end today with seventh and ninth chords and how to orchestrate them effectively. So we can see here in the strings, we have B flat, F, B flat, F, and then F, C. Okay, so it's some kind of B flat chord. We're missing the third, but the key signature kind of implies that the third would be a minor third that we're hearing. An important concept that we learn in harmony is when you orchestrate or when you harmonize ninth chords, you want to put the ninth in the highest voice so that can be heard very clearly. So notice that is placed in the first violin. We have the viola on a low F, so it'll be nice and dark. We have violin 2, B flat F, so very dark. So overall, the strings are going to have a very, very resonant chord. Now, really, really important, you have to make sure that your orchestration doesn't contradict itself. So we learn in harmony that when you place the ninths, you don't want the root above the ninths because it will create a confusion of harmony. So now that we've placed the C in that octave in the violin, when we orchestrate the woodwinds and when we orchestrate the brass, we have to consider the strings and make sure that we don't put the B flat anywhere close and certainly not above that C. Seventh and ninth chords in the woodwinds. So we can see that the upper woodwinds, oboes and flutes are on C and F. Okay, so we don't have that B flat. Notice that the F, which would be the fifth of the chord, is actually placed above the ninths. And here is another rule that we learned from harmony, or more recommendation, is that though in general we suggest having the ninth in the highest voice, it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes if you're really listening, actually having the fifth even higher is really nice for creating spaciousness and linking the different parts together. And if you want to study this more, I would suggest looking at Debussy's piano works. In regards to the clarinets and bassoons, they're on F, A flat, and C. So notice that the woodwinds are contributing here a new partial of the chord, which is the A flat, the seventh, which we didn't have before. This brings us to another really important concept. So we talked about in previous episodes that in general, when you orchestrate, especially for beginning orchestrators, you want the strings to have complete harmony, okay? And in this particular case, it's not really possible to have the A flat in the strings. For one, you need the A flat to arrive in the chord from good voice leading. If you look at the woodwinds, it's arrived at from the G flat going up to the A flat. So the strings don't have the G flat prior, right? They're on a B flat minor chord. So they have a different role that they're fulfilling. The other reason is if you listen to the harmony of the strings, it sounds complete. Now it has that emptiness of like when it's very fifth heavy, but it's a very pleasing effect. So they're not, one could say the A flat is missing from the chord from the strings, but it still sounds complete. So it's important that when you're orchestrating that you don't become so obsessed with representing every part of the chord that you, in French you say surcharge, you overcompensate with your orchestration. This is why ultimately you have to throw out the rules. So let's look at the brass. So we have the low brass on B flat and F. Trombone 1 is on the middle B flat. Uh-oh, what did we talk about? We don't want to make a decision in the brass that will undermine what we did in the strings, right? That's C in the violin 1. So here I give a recommendation. Beware of the danger of the magnifying glass. When you orchestrate, sometimes if you're focusing on a section, it's really nice. You could focus just on that section, okay, just the brass, but you have to be really, really careful that you don't forget about the whole. Because if you have something that sounds really good in the brass, but it doesn't work with the whole, you're going to have really ugly, ugly effects. So in this particular case, look at the violin 1. That C is a line of demarcation. Anything above that, we cannot have a B flat because that's the root. It would be very bad harmony, okay? So in this particular case, we see that the B flat and the trombone 1 is still below the line of demarcation, so we know we're good. The upper brass are trumpets and French horns. There's always a little bit of hesitation with reading them. You have to accept it, okay? It's normal. It's just a little bit more hesitation. We see the trumpets are on a fourth. However, we're on a ninth chord, so we don't know which partials they are exactly. So what I do is go to the lower trumpet, and we see it's on a written D. That means it's a sounding C. And then, okay, the notes are C and F. And then the French horns, I look at its lower note, okay, transpose it down a fifth. So we know that its true notes are F and A flat. Now we're going to do a final check of the orchestration. So we have the trumpets in the same range as the flutes and oboes, so obviously the trumpets will dominate in the texture. I will say the flutes and oboes have a slightly different role because they have that kind of stretch le fond, as we say in French, versus the brass, which are kind of moving through that texture. French horns are on F and A flat, so they're in the staff, so they're filling in the violins a little bit, giving that color of the sevenths. They're also doubling bassoons and clarinets. And I would say overall, we're saturating the medium of the orchestra. In French, we say, il faut que ça soit bien gagné. Okay, you want to make sure when you orchestrate that you have a strong medium. Not too strong, but I think a problem for beginning orchestrators is they sometimes neglect the medium, and so they get orchestration that's really thin or has like undesirable effects. And I actually started drafting a video a couple months ago about the middle voices. So if that is something of interest, stay tuned. Perhaps I'll find time to develop that in a future video. Now, what is the overall sounding result? Definitely the brass are going to feel like the stars of this passage because then they're the highest voices. We're going to have a really nice, rich, resonant bottom with the strings, and the woodwinds will be present but kind of cooling off some of the timbre, the bite from the brass. As a reminder, I'm currently designing orchestration class for YouTube as well as my website that will combine the French and American traditions. So if you have questions or concerns of orchestration that you'd like to see me address in this future class, now is the time to let me know. Thank you for watching, and I wish you the best of luck with your orchestration. One French horn to begin with is not playing, and we don't have the percussion. I bring in the percussion for the very end. This is a very good technique. It's called bringing in the final voice.